A Harvard lecture hall froze when a black student was accused of cheating on his final exam. The professor held up what he called proof, but the room didn't know the truth had been twisted. In 30 seconds, that student's entire future would be destroyed, unless he revealed the one piece of evidence no one saw coming. But would anyone believe him before it was too late? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning light streamed through the narrow dorm window, spilling across the cluttered desk where Jamal Richardson had fallen asleep with his head buried in notes. His pen was still in his hand, the ink faintly smudged across his fingers. The room smelled faintly of cold pizza and highlighter ink, a quiet testament to the weeks he had spent preparing for this exam. For Jamal, this wasn't just another test. It was his proof, the one chance to silence every unspoken doubt about why he was here at Harvard. He pushed himself upright, rubbing his eyes. The campus outside was already alive, the muted roar of bicycles, hurried footsteps, and coffee cups clattering against tables. To his classmates, today was another checkpoint in the race toward law firms, fellowships, and corporate internships. For Jamal, it was heavier. It was a battlefield where every wrong assumption about him, his intelligence, his belonging, his worth would be dragged into the open. He dressed quietly, slipping into a simple gray hoodie and jeans, clothes that wouldn't draw attention. He had learned long ago that blending in was safer. In the mirror, his dark brown eyes held that restless mix of determination and exhaustion. Jamal had worked harder than anyone he knew, not because he loved the grind, but because he had no safety net. His mother's sacrifices hung on his every grade. As he walked toward Emerson Hall, he noticed the difference in how people moved around him. Students who recognized him from class rarely offered greeting. When they did speak to him, it was usually with a peculiar tilt of curiosity, as if he were some experiment they weren't sure how to measure. "You're in Whitmore's seminar too?" Someone had once asked him with genuine surprise, as though a black student sitting in the advanced philosophy course was some irregularity. Jamal remembered replying with a polite nod, even though the sting of the question lingered for days. Inside the exam hall, the air was taut with nervous energy. Desks were arranged in neat rows, lined with scantrons and crisp packets of exam sheets. The clatter of pencils and the rustle of backpacks seemed amplified. At the front, Professor Charles Whitmore arranged his papers with a cold precision. He was a man in his late 50s, tall with neatly combed silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to scan each student like an X-ray. To the world, Whitmore was a legend at Harvard, a decorated academic, an author of countless journals, and a man who held influence over nearly every academic committee. To Jamal, Whitmore was a reminder of the walls that refused to crumble. He rarely looked Jamal's way, unless to question the validity of his arguments in class. Whenever Jamal raised his hand, there was a subtle narrowing of Whitmore's eyes, as if he were waiting for Jamal to stumble. The exam began in silence, the sound of pencils scratching echoing across the room. Jamal's hand moved swiftly, confident. The questions were complex, woven with traps designed to test not just knowledge but interpretation. This was his arena. He had studied late nights, cross-referencing texts, analyzing past papers, constructing frameworks for every possible scenario. While others paused to bite their nails or erase mistakes, Jamal's answers flowed steadily, each line of thought precise and layered. Halfway through, he felt the familiar burn of eyes on him. Looking up, he caught Professor Whitmore watching him. Not the casual, distracted glance of an invigilator, but a pointed, calculating stare. Jamal forced himself to look back down at his paper, focusing harder, though the chill of suspicion lingered. When time was called, students began filing their papers into neat stacks on Whitmore's desk. Some sighed with relief, others whispered anxiously to their friends. Jamal walked quietly to the front, his paper clutched in his hand. He placed it gently atop the pile. That was when it happened. "Mr. Richardson," Whitmore's voice sliced through the murmurs of the room. Every head turned. Jamal froze, his chest tightening. "Yes." His voice came out steadier than he felt. Whitmore picked up Jamal's exam, flipping through it with a frown that deepened with each page. "These answers," he said slowly, "are astonishingly thorough." His tone carried not admiration but accusation. Jamal swallowed. "I studied, Professor." Whitmore's eyes snapped to his, cold and piercing. "Studied? Mr. Richardson, your responses are nearly identical in structure to a published commentary, written only last year. A commentary I doubt you've even read given its limited circulation." The room fell silent. Students leaned forward, their eyes widening, whispers beginning to spread like wildfire. "That's not possible," Jamal said, his heart pounding. "I've never Enough," Whitmore cut in sharply. "I will not tolerate dishonesty in my classroom. This will be investigated thoroughly." Jamal's blood roared in his ears. His mouth opened, but no words came. The humiliation was suffocating. To be accused here, in front of everyone, it was the nightmare he had feared, but never thought would materialize. Behind him he heard the hiss of whispers. Knew it. Affirmative action, right? Didn't think he belonged here anyway. Each word stabbed deeper. Jamal's eyes darted across the room, searching desperately for one face, any face that might show belief in him. But all he saw were narrowed eyes, raised brows, and judgment. Whitmore placed the exam aside, as though contaminated. "You will meet me in my office after this. Until then, I suggest you reflect on the consequences of your choices." Jamal's fists clenched at his sides. His throat ached with the words he wanted to scream. He had spent nights poring over texts, pages stained with ink, hours stolen from sleep, all to be told he could not have done this on his own, that his brilliance could not possibly belong to him. The room began to empty, students glancing back at him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Jamal stood frozen, each step they took away from him deepening the weight pressing on his chest. He gathered his bag slowly, his movements mechanical. Inside, his laptop screen still glowed faintly from the notes he had written. Hundreds of pages of original analysis, drafts, outlines, and thought processes. Proof of his mind at work. Proof no one cared to see. Walking out of the exam hall, the cold corridor seemed longer than ever. His footsteps echoed, each one carrying the unbearable truth. He had been marked guilty before any evidence, condemned by the very man entrusted to uphold fairness. But as Jamal pushed open the heavy door to Whitmore's office hours later, he carried something the professor did not expect. Tucked in his bag, buried beneath his notebooks, was a record, something meticulous, undeniable, a lifeline he had built without realizing how much he would need it. It wasn't just his notes, it wasn't just his laptop history, it was something far stronger. And when Jamal set it down, Whitmore's eyes flickered, not with authority but with the first shadow of fear. The hallway outside Whitmore's office was lined with portraits of Harvard's most celebrated alumni. Men in dark suits stared down from gilded frames, their painted eyes fixed with an air of triumph. Jamal stood beneath them, his bag heavy against his shoulder, his chest tight. He felt small under their gaze, as though the very walls were whispering that he didn't belong. Inside Whitmore's office, the air was thick with leather and authority. Bookshelves towered, lined with volumes worn at the edges. Whitmore sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, eyes sharp. The silence between them stretched, heavy with accusation. "Sit, Mr. Richardson." Jamal lowered himself into the chair. He reached into his bag, pulling out his laptop. The machine whirred as it woke, screen illuminating his tired face. "I don't need excuses," Whitmore said flatly. "These aren't excuses," Jamal answered quietly, opening a folder. "They're draft notes. Proof that every word on that exam came from me." The screen glowed with pages of outlines, annotated readings, comparisons of theories written in Jamal's meticulous hand, date-stamped files stretching back months, work that only someone who had lived inside those books could produce. For the first time, Whitmore hesitated. His eyes flickered across the screen, but his expression remained controlled. "Anyone could fabricate this," he said coldly. "Digital timestamps are meaningless." Jamal swallowed. "Then look at this." From his bag he pulled a notebook battered at the edges. Inside, his handwriting sprawled across hundreds of pages, messy equations, marginalia, arrows pointing to revised thoughts, lines crossed and rewritten. It was raw, unpolished, undeniably authentic. Whitmore stared for a moment, then closed the notebook with deliberate care. "This doesn't change the fact that your exam mirrored a commentary few undergraduates would know. Maybe because I read everything I can get my hands on," Jamal replied, his voice trembling now. "Because while everyone else is sleeping, I'm working 2 jobs to pay rent, and still finding time to study. Maybe because I have to fight twice as hard to prove I even belong here." Whitmore's eyes narrowed, the silence stretching again. Finally he leaned back. "We'll see what the disciplinary board says." Jamal's stomach dropped. "So you're really going to push this?" Whitmore folded his hands. "Integrity is the foundation of this institution. If you've nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear." But Jamal could see it now. The quiet satisfaction in the professor's gaze. The decision already made. He gathered his things, every muscle tight with suppressed rage. As he left the office, the whispers began again. A group of students by the stairwell paused in their conversation. their voices dipping just enough for Jamal to catch fragments. Knew it was too good to be true. Guy like him doesn't pull grades like that without help. Probably been cheating the whole time. Jamal's jaw clenched. He kept walking, forcing his eyes forward. But the words clung like oil. By the time he reached his dorm, his phone buzzed with messages. Not from friends. Those were silent, but from the digital world where rumors moved faster than truth. A post on the student forum. Whitmore caught Richardson cheating, followed by a cascade of comments. Figures. He's been getting a free ride. Some of us actually earned our spots here. Harvard needs to stop admitting people like him just to look diverse. He threw the phone face down on his desk, his pulse hammering. The truth was, no one saw what it took for him to stand here. No one saw the nights he left his job at the dining hall past midnight, reeking of grease, his fingers blistered from trays, only to open his books and study until dawn. No one saw the shifts at the library desk on weekends, his stomach aching with hunger because he skipped meals to save money. Jamal's mother, Denise Richardson, worked 2 jobs herself, nursing aide by day, retail cashier by night. Her body ached, her hands cracked from scrubbing floors and washing linens. Every phone call with her carried the same words. Just keep going, baby. Make it worth it. He had promised her he would. He couldn't let this accusation undo all that sacrifice. But Harvard was a place where sacrifice didn't matter, where privilege cloaked mistakes and money softened failures. For Jamal, one accusation was enough to unravel everything. The next day, walking across campus, he felt eyes on him everywhere. Conversations hushed when he passed. In lecture, empty seats suddenly surrounded him. Even professors who had once nodded politely now avoided his gaze. After class, a fellow student, Caleb, a pale-faced boy who always boasted about his senator father, leaned against the wall and smirked. Tough break, Richardson. Guess the truth finally caught up with you. Jamal stiffened. You don't know the truth. Caleb's smirk widened. I know Whitmore doesn't play games. And between you and him, guess who the board will believe? The words stung, because Jamal knew they were true. Whitmore's voice carried weight. His own? Barely a whisper against the machinery of Harvard. That night, Jamal sat in the library long after closing, staring at his open notebook, but unable to focus. His chest ached with a heaviness he couldn't shake. He remembered a night from years earlier, his senior year of high school, when a guidance counselor had told him not to aim too high. Maybe try a state college, Jamal. Somewhere more realistic, the man had said gently. Jamal had smiled politely, but inside he had vowed to prove him wrong. Harvard had been that proof. Every grade, every paper, every sleepless night, his rebellion against every person who doubted him. And now with one accusation, it was all crumbling. As the days passed, the scandal grew. Students whispered louder. Some avoided him entirely. Others snickered when he walked by. Online, anonymous posts turned crueler. He'll be gone by next semester. Bet he plagiarized everything. Whitmore should make an example out of him. Even his roommate, Ryan, grew distant. One night, Jamal walked in to hear Ryan whispering on the phone. Yeah, man, it's crazy. He seemed smart, but who knows? I'm just keeping my distance. The words sliced deep. Even here, in the small room where he had built a fragile sense of belonging, the floor was falling out beneath him. But Jamal wasn't only carrying Harvard on his shoulders. He was carrying his mother's dreams, his family's sacrifices, his own desperate need to prove he wasn't a mistake. Every time he felt the walls closing in, he saw his mother's face, lined with exhaustion yet brightened with pride when she spoke of her son at Harvard. He couldn't let her down. He sat at his desk, pulled his notebook closer, and began to write. Not for class, not for grades, but to remind himself of his own voice. Words spilled across the page, raw and furious. He wrote about the invisible weight of being black, in spaces that insisted you didn't belong. About how genius was never assumed, only suspicion. About how his brilliance was treated as borrowed light, never his own. It steadied him, but only for a moment. Because the next morning, when he walked into the cafeteria, everything changed. On the bulletin board near the entrance, someone had pinned a printout. It was an excerpt from Jamal's high school file. Confidential, something no one outside admission should have had. In bold letters at the top, academic concerns, possible irregularities in coursework. Students gathered around, whispering, pointing. Jamal's stomach dropped. He remembered that note. He remembered the teacher who had accused him back then too. Wrongly, unfairly, but permanently staining his record. He had thought Harvard had looked past it. Now here it was again, resurrected like a ghost. And this time, it wasn't just Whitmore's accusation. It was his entire past, clawing its way back to destroy him. As Jamal stared at the paper, frozen in horror, a new thought cut through him like ice. If someone had dug up his old file, then this wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was a deliberate campaign to bury him. The paper pinned to the cafeteria board burned into Jamal's mind for days. He avoided the dining hall after that, unable to stand the sidelong glances, the whispers that seemed to follow him into every corner of campus. The whispers weren't just idle gossip anymore. They were history weaponized, old shadows dragged back to paint him as guilty before any verdict. And then just when he thought the humiliation couldn't worsen, came the day in Whitmore's lecture hall. The room was packed, students pressed shoulder to shoulder in narrow rows of desks, their laptops glowing faintly as they prepared to take notes. The hum of conversation filled the air, until Whitmore walked in. His presence silenced the room almost immediately. Whitmore carried himself with the kind of authority that didn't require raising his voice. Tall, broad-shouldered, his silver hair immaculate, his suit pressed without a wrinkle, he was Harvard incarnate. Students respected him, feared him even. His words could shape their futures, open doors or slam them shut. Jamal sat near the middle, head down, notebook open. He had come determined to focus, to drown out the noise. He thought foolishly that maybe Whitmore would keep the accusation private until the board hearing. But Whitmore had other plans. Halfway through the lecture, while discussing a case study on academic integrity, Whitmore paused. His eyes scanned the room, sharp as glass, until they settled on Jamal. "Mr. Richardson," he said, his tone casual yet edged with steel. Jamal's pen froze mid-sentence. Slowly, he lifted his eyes. Whitmore clasped his hands behind his back. "Since you seem to be an authority on original thought, perhaps you'd care to explain to the class why your exam answers bear striking resemblance to a published commentary." The words fell like a thunderclap. Students shifted in their seats. Laptops snapped shut. A ripple of murmurs spread across the room, low and hungry. Jamal's throat went dry. "Professor, I don't understand why." Whitmore raised a hand, silencing him. "I will not entertain excuses. Integrity is the lifeblood of scholarship. Without it, this institution is nothing more than smoke and mirrors. I will not let that standard slip, not for anyone." Gasps and whispers rolled through the lecture hall. Some students leaned toward one another, whispering not so quietly. "Knew it. Heard he cheated. Explains the great diversity pick, right? They'll bend rules for him." Jamal felt heat crawl up his neck. Every face around him blurred into a sea of judgment. He opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. He had worked too hard, too long to defend himself with trembling excuses, yet silence made him look guilty. Finally he forced out, "That's not true." His voice was low, tight, with anger. Whitmore tilted his head, studying him like an insect under glass. "Not true." Jamal's hands tightened into fists beneath the desk. "I didn't cheat. Every answer was mine." A few students chuckled, the sound sharp and cruel. Whitmore stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "If that is so, then surely you can explain how your answers mirror a work written by Dr. Lawrence Kemp, an academic text not assigned in this class, and hardly accessible to the average student." The name struck Jamal like a blow. He had read Kemp's work, stumbled across it in the library's archives weeks earlier, buried in an old journal. He had drawn from it, yes, but to build his own arguments, weaving Kemp's theory into something original. That was what scholars did: engage, challenge, expand. But now, framed through Whitmore's words, it sounded damning. "I used it as a reference," Jamal said firmly. "I didn't copy. My notes Notes can be fabricated," Whitmore cut in, his voice rising just enough to fill the room. "The point, Mr. Richardson, is that dishonesty corrodes trust, and trust, once lost, is near impossible to regain." The murmurs grew louder, echoing off the walls. Jamal felt the weight of every eye on him, their judgment pressing like chains. He wanted to scream, to stand on the desk and shout the truth until his voice broke. Instead, he forced himself to breathe, to stay composed. "Professor," he said, his voice steady now, "I worked for those answers. You can accuse me, but I won't sit here and let you erase everything I've done." The room stilled. For a moment it seemed Jamal had wrestled back control of his voice. His heart pounded, but his words carried conviction. Whitmore's lips curved into a thin smile. "Very well," he said smoothly. "If you insist on defense, then let the class see the evidence." He turned, reaching for a folder on his desk. The room leaned forward collectively. Breaths held. Curiosity electric. Jamal's stomach twisted. Whitmore opened the folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. He held them aloft like a prosecutor brandishing damning proof. "These," he declared, "are passages from Dr. Kemp's commentary." His eyes flicked to Jamal, cold and deliberate. "And these," he lifted Jamal's exam pages, "are yours. Note the similarity." Students craned their necks as Whitmore read aloud, voice booming. Kemp writes, "The intersection of morality and governance relies not on obedience but on the implicit agreement between ruler and ruled. In Mr. Richardson, the essence of governance is not compliance, but the tacit contract between the governed and those who govern." The words hung heavy. To the untrained ear, they were nearly identical. A hush swept the room, then whispers erupted again, louder than before. Jamal's chest constricted. He remembered writing that line. He remembered the night sitting cross-legged on his bed, surrounded by books, Kemp's commentary open beside him. He had been careful phrasing it in his own way, but now, stripped of context, it sounded like theft. Whitmore read another pair of lines, each one twisting the knife deeper. By the time he finished, the verdict in the room was clear. Students weren't whispering anymore. They were staring, some with pity, others with smug certainty. Jamal gripped the edge of his desk, knuckles white. His vision blurred with rage and humiliation. He wanted to protest, to shout that academic work was about building on others, that no idea existed in a vacuum. But he knew none of them would hear him. Not when Whitmore's voice carried the weight of authority, and his own carried only suspicion. Whitmore lowered the papers, his voice calm again. "Mr. Richardson, until the board reviews this matter, consider yourself under academic scrutiny. Your standing at this institution is now precarious." The final word landed like a gavel. Jamal sat frozen, his face burning. Around him, students began typing again, whispering, sneaking glances. To them it was entertainment. To him it was devastation. The lecture resumed as though nothing had happened. But Jamal heard nothing. His body was in the room, but his mind reeled. The papers, the so-called evidence, it was damning. And yet it wasn't the whole truth. Something inside him hardened. He couldn't let this be the end. He had to fight, not just for himself, but for every invisible burden he carried, for every sacrifice his mother had made. He started gathering his things, his movements rigid, his notebook slid across the desk, pages spilling open, pages filled with drafts, thought processes, citations. Proof that he hadn't copied, proof Whitmore hadn't cared to see. But as Jamal reached down to collect them, he noticed something strange. On one of the photocopied pages Whitmore had waved in front of the class, faint but visible, was a marking in the corner, a stamp from Harvard's restricted archives. Jamal froze. That journal wasn't supposed to leave the archives. It wasn't available to check out. Only faculty had access to physical copies, which meant his stomach turned. If Whitmore was holding it now, then this wasn't a coincidence. He hadn't noticed similarities. He had searched for them, and suddenly, Jamal understood. Whitmore hadn't just accused him. He had orchestrated this. As Jamal prepared to fight back, Whitmore leaned closer, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp whisper, meant only for him. "Careful, Mr. Richardson. Some battles were lost before they even began." Then he slid another page across the desk, one that made Jamal's blood run cold. The paper Whitmore had slid across Jamal's desk haunted him long after the lecture ended. It was a page highlighted in red ink, circled with accusations of plagiarism. The professor hadn't said a word more about it, not in front of the class, not even when Jamal lingered, desperate to argue his case. He had only closed his folder, tucked the papers away, and dismissed him with a final cutting glance. When Jamal stepped out of the lecture hall, the air felt different. Conversations hushed when he passed. A few students didn't bother whispering, smirks curled on their lips, laughter tucked behind their hands. He heard the word cheater tossed carelessly into the air, and though no one said it directly to his face, every sideways glance, every half-hidden grin screamed it louder than words ever could. By the time he reached his dorm, the story had already taken on a life of its own. His phone buzzed non-stop, group chats lighting up, emails flooding in, anonymous posts multiplying on the student forum. Whitmore called him out in front of everyone. Apparently it's not the first time he's had academic issues. Knew something was off. He's been way too lucky with those grades. Luck. That word sliced the deepest. Because for Jamal, Nothing had ever been luck. Every grade had been earned at the cost of sleep, comfort, and the simple joys of youth. Every success had been pulled from the margins, carved out with sheer will, yet to them, his achievements were the product of chance, or worse, fraud. By dinner, whispers weren't enough. Students walked past his table and muttered just loud enough to sting. Guess admissions quotas finally caught up. Bet they'll use this to prove why diversity's a mistake. The words weren't just about him. They were indictments of everyone who looked like him. Jamal clenched his fists under the table, forcing himself to swallow the fury that burned his throat. When he returned to his dorm later, Ryan, his roommate, sat stiffly at his desk. Normally Ryan greeted him with some half-joking comment about the day, but tonight, silence hung heavy. Jamal tried to ignore it, dropping his bag on his bed. "You talked to Whitmore yet?" Ryan finally asked, his voice careful, distant. "Yeah," Jamal said quietly. "I showed him my notes, my laptop, everything. And he doesn't care." Jamal's voice broke before he could stop it. He already made up his mind. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. "Look, man, I don't know. This looks bad. Everyone's saying you copied that guy's work. I just don't want to get dragged into it. You know?" Jamal turned to him slowly. "Dragged into what?" "I didn't do anything wrong." Ryan didn't answer. His silence was louder than words. That night, Jamal lay awake long after Ryan's steady breathing filled the room. Betrayal pressed down heavier than the accusation itself. Even the person who lived a few feet away, who saw his late nights, his endless studying, chose suspicion over belief. The next morning, Jamal's inbox exploded. Emails from professors, curt and formal, requesting clarification about his academic practices. A note from the dean's office, summoning him to an integrity review hearing. And buried in the flood, a short cutting email from a scholarship committee. "Due to recent developments, your eligibility for continued funding is under review." His hands trembled as he read it. That scholarship wasn't just money, it was survival. Without it, he couldn't afford to stay at Harvard. The injustice had become more than whispers. It was official, it was structural, and it was suffocating. Walking across campus, Jamal felt the isolation sharpen. Professors avoided eye contact. Classmates gave him wide berth. A girl he had once partnered with on a project clutched her notebook tighter when he sat near her, as if dishonesty were contagious. He heard laughter once as he walked past the quad. Caleb and a group of friends, mimicking his voice, reciting exaggerated cheater excuses. One of them said, maybe he thought Kemp was his uncle or something. The others roared with laughter. Jamal stopped, fists tightening, but he forced himself to keep moving. Fighting them wouldn't change their minds. It would only give them more to twist. But the cruelty wasn't limited to students. In the library, where Jamal often found refuge, the woman at the desk eyed him with suspicion when he checked out books. In class, a professor paused while grading papers, his eyes flicking to Jamal as though considering whether his work was worth reading at all. The weight was crushing, invisible but relentless. By the end of the week, the narrative had hardened. Jamal Richardson, the cheater, not a question, not an accusation, a fact, written into campus folklore. His name whispered in dining halls, dorm rooms, study groups, his reputation reduced to a cautionary tale. But beneath the noise, something unexpected stirred. In the back row of Whitmore's lecture hall, Emily Carter watched quietly. She wasn't Jamal's friend, not really. They had spoken a handful of times, partnered once on a small assignment. She was pale-skinned, reserved, the kind of student who rarely raised her hand but always turned in perfect work. Yet something about the way Whitmore had handled the accusation unsettled her. She had seen professors confront students before, but never like that. Not so public, not so ruthless. And when he presented the evidence, she noticed something off. A faint stamp in the corner of the page, one Jamal seemed to notice too. She hadn't understood it at the time, but the detail lingered in her mind. She logged into the online student forum that night, scrolling through the avalanche of cruel posts about Jamal. She saw the same phrases repeated. Whitmore has evidence. The exam matched word for word, but Emily remembered the phrasing. It hadn't been word for word. It had been close, yes, but not exact. Enough to raise suspicion, but not enough to convict without context. The nuance was lost in the echo chamber of gossip. She opened a new tab, searching for Dr. Kemp's commentary. It wasn't easy to find. Access required a faculty login, something she didn't have. She tried the library's database, but the text was locked behind barriers. That detail gnawed at her. How then, Had Whitmore produced it so quickly? Her heart quickened. Maybe she was imagining things. Maybe she was just tired. But what if she wasn't? What if the professor's case wasn't as airtight as everyone believed? Still, she hesitated. Speaking up meant putting herself at risk. Going against Whitmore wasn't just bold. It was dangerous. His reputation could crush her like an ant, but she couldn't ignore the unease growing in her chest. Meanwhile, Jamal sat in his room, the glow of his laptop casting shadows across his face. He scrolled through post after post, each one another stone added to the pile on his back. His body ached with exhaustion, but sleep wouldn't come. His phone buzzed with a new message. Anonymous. He opened it hesitantly. You don't know me, but I saw something in class. Whitmore's evidence isn't what it looks like. Be careful. Don't give up. Jamal stared at the words, his pulse racing. For the first time in days, hope flickered in his chest. Someone had noticed. Someone wasn't buying the narrative. But who? And more importantly, what exactly had they seen? As Jamal reread the message, the screen went dark, his laptop suddenly shutting down. When it restarted, a warning flashed across the screen. Unauthorized access detected. Someone wasn't just whispering about Jamal anymore. They were watching. The warning on Jamal's laptop glared like a red wound across the screen. Unauthorized access detected. For a long moment, he sat frozen, the blue glow painting his face in cold light. Someone had tried to get into his file. The same files he had shown Whitmore. The same files that proved his work was his own. His pulse quickened. This wasn't just whispers anymore. Someone wanted to erase his defense before he even had a chance to present it. He shut the laptop quickly, his hands trembling, and leaned back in his chair. Ryan stirred in his bed across the room, but didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't need to. The silence between them had thickened into something permanent. Jamal knew now, in Ryan's mind, he was guilty, and guilt was contagious. That night, Jamal lay awake staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed every moment of his journey here. Every time doubt had been planted in his path. Every time he had been forced to carry the extra weight of other people's assumptions. He remembered ninth grade, when he'd turned in an essay on Baldwin. The teacher had pulled him aside after class, eyes narrowing. "This is excellent," she'd said. "Too excellent. Where did you copy it from?" Jamal had stood frozen, cheeks burning. He hadn't copied a word, but no matter how much he insisted, her suspicion lingered. He remembered the basketball coach stopping him in the hallway his sophomore year, clapping him on the shoulder. "Heard you're fast. You play." Jamal had shaken his head, telling him he was more interested in debate club. The coach's smile faltered, just slightly, before he walked away. The message was clear. Boys who looked like Jamal belonged on the court, not behind a lectern. And he remembered the college counselor who had chuckled when Jamal said he was applying to Harvard. Reach schools are fine, but you should be realistic. Maybe a local state university. You don't want to set yourself up for disappointment. That memory still burned the deepest, because it wasn't just doubt, it was dismissal, a denial of possibility before he'd even had the chance to try. Now, in Whitmore's accusation, Jamal saw not just one professor's suspicion, but the sum of all those slights converging. His brilliance wasn't brilliance. It was always luck, or a fluke, or cheating. He wasn't allowed to just be excellent. His excellence always had to be explained away. The next day, Jamal carried himself to class with heavy steps. The whispers followed him. The looks burned into his skin, but something inside had shifted. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting against every teacher who had doubted, every counselor who had dismissed, every stranger who had only seen him as a stereotype. But the weight of the fight was unbearable. After class, he went to the library, seeking quiet. He sat in the far corner pulling out his notebook, letting the pen move across the page. He wrote not for the board or for Whitmore, but for himself. He wrote about the quiet violence of being doubted, the way it hollowed you from the inside out. He wrote about how suspicion clung to him like smoke, following him into every room. A shadow fell across the table. Jamal looked up to see Emily Carter standing awkwardly, a stack of books in her arms. "Hey," she said softly. Jamal blinked. They weren't friends, barely even acquaintances. "Hi." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I just wanted to say I don't think it's fair, what Whitmore did, the way he called you out like that." Jamal studied her face, searching for mockery, but found none, just sincerity, cautious but real. "Thanks," he said finally. His voice cracked, and he hated that it did. Emily shifted her books. "I noticed something about the paper he showed. The one from Kemp. There was a stamp, Archive access only. Students can't get that. Only faculty. Jamal's pulse jumped. So he hadn't imagined it. Emily leaned closer. I don't know what it means, but it doesn't sit right with me. Before Jamal could respond, a group of students walked past, snickering. Look, the cheaters found a defender, one of them said. The others laughed. Emily flushed, gripping her books tighter. Jamal looked him down at his notebook, shame and fury tangling in his chest. After they left, Emily lowered her voice again. Be careful. If he's willing to do this in public, I don't know what he'll do in private. She walked away before he could answer. Jamal sat frozen, her words circling his mind. Be careful. That night he received another email. This one from the dean's office, summoning him to a private meeting with Whitmore before the disciplinary board hearing. His stomach dropped. The meeting was set for the following afternoon. When Jamal entered Whitmore's office, the same heavy silence filled the room. Books lined the walls. Certificates and awards gleamed. Whitmore sat behind his desk, his expression calm but unreadable. Mr. Richardson, he said, gesturing to the chair. Sit. Jamal obeyed, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Whitmore leaned back, studying him. You've caused quite a stir. I didn't cheat, Jamal said quickly, his voice firm. You know I didn't. Whitmore tilted his head, as if amused. The board will decide that. You've already decided, Jamal shot back. That's why you humiliated me in class. For the first time, Whitmore's composure cracked. His lips thinned, his eyes sharpening. Watch your tone, Mr. Richardson. Jamal leaned forward. Why? Because I'm not supposed to question you. Because people like me are supposed to sit down and take it. Whitmore's jaw tightened. The silence stretched. And then he smirked. Just slightly. You should be grateful, you know. Jamal blinked. Grateful? Whitmore's voice dropped lower, each word deliberate. Without policies that bend the rules, you wouldn't even be here. This institution has raised its standards for centuries. And then suddenly, we lower the bar. For what? Optics? Diversity? The words hit like fists. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. He stared at Whitmore, stunned. You're saying, his voice shook with rage. You're saying I don't belong here? Whitmore leaned forward, eyes cold. I'm saying you should know your place. The words hung in the air like poison, searing into Jamal's chest. And in that moment, Jamal realized this wasn't about plagiarism. It was never about plagiarism. It was about who he was, and who Whitmore believed he could never be. Jamal clenched his fists, heart pounding, as he prepared to respond. But before he could speak, Whitmore's phone buzzed, and the name flashing across the screen made Jamal's blood run cold. The phone buzzed on Whitmore's desk, its sharp vibration cutting through the suffocating silence. Jamal's eyes flicked down instinctively, and when he saw the name glowing on the screen, his breath caught. Dean Marshall. Whitmore made no move to silence the call. He let it buzz, steady and deliberate, before finally pressing a finger to decline. His gaze returned to Jamal, lips curved into the faintest smirk, as if to say, see? Even the highest office calls me. Even here my power stands above yours. Jamal's chest burned. He had walked into this meeting hoping naively that evidence, reason, and his own work could clear his name. But now he understood the truth. This wasn't a matter of reason. This was a matter of perception. And Whitmore's perception, rooted in a bias he didn't even bother hiding, was going to stain everything Jamal had fought for. He rose from the chair slowly, forcing his legs to move even as his body shook with suppressed rage. You can do whatever you want, he said quietly. But I'm not letting you erase me. Whitmore didn't flinch. He leaned back, steepling his fingers again, eyes glittering. We'll see what the board said. The words followed Jamal out of the office like smoke, clinging to him long after he'd stepped into the crisp Cambridge air. That evening, Jamal dialed his mother. He didn't want to tell her yet, didn't want to add to her already endless worries, but the story was spreading too fast, and he knew she would hear it sooner or later. Hey Ma, he said, trying to sound casual. Her voice came tired but warm, the sound of home. Baby, you sound worn out. You've been studying too hard again. He almost laughed, but the sound caught in his throat. Something like that. There was silence on the line, the kind that stretched, filled with the things unsaid between them. His mother had always known when something was wrong. What happened, Jamal? She asked softly. His chest tightened. He stared at the wall, unable to find the words. They think I cheated, Ma. On the exam. For a long moment, There was nothing but static. Then her breath caught, sharp and broken. Cheated? I didn't, Jamal said quickly, desperation leaking into his voice. I swear to you, I didn't. I studied, I worked. Baby, I know, she interrupted. Her voice cracked, but the certainty in it cut through his panic. I know you didn't. That was all it took. The dam inside him broke. He closed his eyes, pressing the phone to his ear as hot tears slipped down his cheeks. I worked so hard, he whispered. I gave everything, ma. And now they look at me like I'm nothing. Like I was never supposed to be here in the first place. Her silence was heavy, not from doubt but from pain. Jamal pictured her sitting at the kitchen table back home, still in her scrubs from her nursing shift, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. He pictured the small stack of bills always at her elbow, the endless sacrifices she made, so he could stand in those ivy-covered halls. Jamal, she said finally, her voice trembling, you listen to me. You are not nothing. You've been fighting this fight since you were a boy, and every step you took was earned. Don't let them take that from you. He swallowed hard, wiping at his eyes. But what if they win? What if they ruin me? There was a pause, and then her voice hardened, like steel forged through fire. They can't ruin what's already inside you. They can take their paper, their reputation, their lies, but they can't take the truth. And the truth is, you're more than they can ever see. Jamal pressed his forehead to the cool surface of his desk, clinging to her words like a lifeline. But when the call ended, the silence of the dorm pressed in again. Ryan had left for the night, leaving Jamal alone, with the shadows. And in the shadows, the weight of it all settled heavier than ever. Back home, Denise Richardson sat at the kitchen table, long after the call, staring at the peeling paint on the wall. The hum of the old refrigerator filled the silence, but her mind was loud, racing. She had believed Harvard would be the answer. She had worked double shifts, missed meals, sacrificed sleep. Also, Jamal could walk through doors that had always been shut to people like them. She had carried the dream that education was the great equalizer, that once he was there, once he proved himself, the world would have to see him. Now, that dream felt fragile. She remembered the night Jamal's acceptance letter had come, the way he had run through the house shouting, waving the envelope like a flag. She had cried, holding him so tightly she thought her arms might break. You did it, she'd whispered. You showed them all. And now, she feared, they were trying to take it away. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from a neighbor who had seen the online posts. Is it true about Jamal? Denise's stomach clenched. Even here, hundreds of miles away, the whispers had reached them. She pushed the phone aside, covering her face with her hands. She thought of the nights she'd worked until her feet bled, the mornings she came home just in time to see Jamal off to school, praying her exhaustion didn't show. She thought of all the times she'd told him the world would try to break him, but if he stayed true, he'd win. And now, she feared she had lied. 2 days later, Denise sat in her car outside the hospital where she worked. The engine off, the world quiet. She couldn't stop replaying his voice on the phone. Broken, small, desperate. Jamal had always been strong, always carried himself with a quiet dignity. To hear him doubting himself, questioning his worth, it cut deeper than anything. And then a memory surfaced. Something she hadn't thought about in years. Back when Jamal was in high school, there had been an incident. A teacher had accused him of plagiarizing a history paper. Denise had marched into that school, armed with her son's handwritten drafts, demanding they look again. Eventually, the accusation had been dropped, quietly swept away, but the note had stayed in his file. She had tried to forget it, tried to move on, but now she realized it hadn't gone away. That same note was probably what someone had dug up, the one pinned to the cafeteria board. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. If that note could resurface, then maybe, just maybe, there were other things buried in those files. Things that could prove a pattern. Denise's heart raced. She didn't know how yet, but she knew this. She wasn't going to sit by and let her son be destroyed by the same prejudice she had fought years ago. She started the car, determination burning through her exhaustion. Denise Richardson had remembered something else that day. Something the teacher had said in that long-ago meeting. A careless comment, dismissed at the time. But now, as the memory sharpened, she realized it might hold the key to unraveling everything Whitmore was trying to do. Denise's memory replayed in fragments. Voices in a high school office, papers on a desk, teachers' careless words. She hadn't told Jamal yet, not wanting to add to his burden until she was sure. But the recollection gnawed at her. The system had marked him long before Harvard. Now it was happening again. On a larger stage, with higher stakes. Meanwhile, back in Cambridge, Jamal's world shrank smaller by the hour. The dorm hallways that once felt neutral now buzzed with hostile silence. Students stepped aside when he passed, eyes flicking away as if looking at him too long might stain their reputations. In class, even the professors who didn't mention his name looked at him differently, their questions sharper, their praise conspicuously absent. The cafeteria was the worst. Conversations dimmed when he walked in. Tables filled quickly, yet the seat beside him always remained empty. He tried to eat fast, head bent low, but the whispers pierced anyway. Still here? Thought he'd have been kicked out by now. Shows you what money can't buy: integrity. Every word cut deeper. One evening, Jamal sat alone in the library, surrounded by towers of books he could barely focus on. He stared at his notes, hands trembling, his mind a storm of fury and despair. He wanted to scream, to tear down the walls around him, to demand they see him for who he was. But he had learned long ago that loudness from someone like him was never heard as passion. It was heard as threat. That was when Emily Carter appeared. She hovered near his table for a moment, shifting awkwardly with her books. Jamal barely looked up. He assumed she'd pass by like everyone else. But then she set her stack down and slid into the chair across from him. "Hi," she said softly. Jamal blinked, caught off guard. "Hey." Emily tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her expression careful but resolute. "I wanted to ask if you're okay." He almost laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Do I look okay?" She flushed but didn't look away. "No. But I thought, maybe you shouldn't go through this alone." Jamal studied her. She was the last person he expected to say that. Quiet, reserved, barely more than a face in his classes. He narrowed his eyes. "Why are you here?" Emily hesitated. "Because I saw something. The day Whitmore accused you. I don't think it adds up." Jamal's heart skipped. He leaned forward. "What do you mean?" She lowered her voice. "The paper he showed. The one from Kemp. It had a stamp in the corner. Archive access only. Students can't get that. Only faculty." Jamal's breath caught. "You noticed that too?" Emily nodded. "Yeah, and there's something else." The phrasing he read out loud. It wasn't identical. Similar, sure, but academic writing overlaps all the time. The way he presented it, though, it was meant to sound like plagiarism. But it wasn't proof. Not really. For the first time in weeks, Jamal felt a spark of something other than despair. Hope. Someone else had seen it. Someone else believed him. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked cautiously. Emily looked down at her hands. "Because it isn't right. I know Whitmore is respected. But the way he handled it, publicly humiliating you like that, it felt wrong, and I can't just ignore it." Jamal swallowed hard, emotions tightening his throat. "Everyone else has." Her eyes lifted, steady. "I'm not everyone else." The words struck him with unexpected force. For weeks he had been drowning in silence, abandoned by friends, professors, even his roommate. Now here was Emily, someone who owed him nothing, choosing to stand beside him. Still, caution lingered. "If you speak against Whitmore, you'll be putting yourself at risk. He's powerful." "I know," she said quietly. "But power doesn't make him right." They sat in silence for a moment, the library's faint hum wrapping around them. Jamal's chest ached, not from despair this time but from the fragile relief of being seen. Finally, Emily pulled something from her bag, a slim flash drive. She slid it across the table toward him. "What's this?" Jamal asked. "I've been doing some digging," she said, her voice low. "I work part-time at the library archives. It's just clerical stuff, scanning, filing, but I have access to certain logs. I checked the borrowing records for Kemp's commentary. Do you know who was the last person to access it?" Jamal's eyes widened. "Whitmore." Emily nodded. 2 weeks before the exam. The air between them thickened. Jamal's mind raced. That meant Whitmore had looked at the text deliberately before accusing him. This wasn't a professor stumbling upon similarities. This was premeditated. His hands tightened around the flash drive. "If you share this, they'll come after you." "I know," Emily admitted. "That's why I haven't told anyone else. But you need it. You deserve to fight back." Jamal's throat ached. Gratitude warred with fear inside him. "Why are you helping me?" Emily hesitated, then whispered, "Because silence makes me complicit, and I don't want to be." Jamal stared at her, the weight of her words pressing into him. He had grown so used to isolation that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand with him. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe a little easier. But the relief didn't last. That night, when he plugged in the flash drive, his laptop froze for several minutes before finally opening the files. Inside were logs, scans, timestamps, records of faculty checkouts. Clear as day: Whitmore, Charles. Accessed Kemp commentary. Location restricted archives. Jamal's pulse pounded in his ears. This was proof. Proof that Whitmore hadn't discovered his plagiarism by accident. Proof that the professor had been laying the trap all along. But as he scrolled, a second log caught his eye. One Emily hadn't mentioned. Another name. Another faculty member who had accessed the commentary just days before Whitmore. Dean Marshall. Jamal's stomach dropped. Why would the dean be involved? Why would he have touched that text at all? Before he could think further, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Emily. "Don't tell anyone you have it yet. If Whitmore finds out, he'll come after us both. Let's talk tomorrow." Jamal sat back, heart racing. The weight of the discovery pressed hard against the air in his room. Whitmore wasn't acting alone, or at least he wasn't the only one who had handled that commentary. The conspiracy felt wider, darker, more deliberate, and with Emily stepping into his corner, Jamal knew one thing for certain: the fight had just changed. But as Emily closed her laptop across campus that same night, a notification popped up on her screen. An anonymous warning, just like the one Jamal had received before. "Stay out of this, or you'll regret it." Emily stared at the warning glowing on her laptop screen. "Stay out of this, or you'll regret it." Her stomach tightened. She had seen threats before. Cowardly messages on anonymous forums, passive-aggressive comments from classmates. But this was different. This wasn't rumor. This was directed at her, precise and chilling. She closed the lid quickly, her pulse racing. The room around her felt suddenly smaller, shadows heavier. Was someone watching her? Had someone traced her searches? She thought of the archive logs, the flash drive she had given Jamal, the names written in black and white: Whitmore, Dean Marshall. If someone knew she had seen that, then she was already in danger. Across campus, Jamal was wide awake. The discovery on the flash drive gnawed at him, an itch beneath his skin. Whitmore accessing the commentary could be explained as preparation for class, but combined with the public humiliation, the suspicious evidence, and now Emily's warning, it felt like more. And then there was the dean. Why would the dean of Harvard touch a restricted commentary days before his exam? Jamal's thoughts spiraled until exhaustion finally dragged him under. The next day, Emily found him in the library, his face drawn and pale from lack of sleep. She slid into the seat across from him, lowering her voice. "Did you read all of it?" she asked. Jamal nodded, pulling the flash drive from his pocket. "Whitmore, the dean, both accessed the text, but that's not what's keeping me up. It's the exam." Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" Jamal leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Something's been bothering me since the day he accused me. The copy he waved around in class, it didn't look like my handwriting." Emily blinked. "What?" "I've gone over my drafts, my notes. I know how I phrase things. That paper didn't feel like mine. At first I thought I was imagining it, but now," he hesitated, anger flickering across his face, "I think Whitmore swapped it." The words landed between them, like thunder. Emily's breath caught. "If that's true, it means he framed me," Jamal said sharply. His jaw tightened. "And it means he planted the evidence to make it stick." Silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. Emily's eyes darted to the side. There might be a way to know for sure. Exams are scanned into the system for record keeping. If we can get into the digital archive, we might find the original. Jamal's pulse quickened. "Can you?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. "I think so. I've seen the back end of the archive system. It's not supposed to be accessed by students, but I might know a way in." For the first time in days, Jamal allowed himself to hope. That night, Emily sat in her dorm room, laptop open, her fingers trembling as she typed. She pulled up the system she had learned to navigate during her part-time job, her eyes darting to the door every few seconds. If she got caught, the consequences would be severe: academic probation at best, expulsion at worst. But she couldn't stop. Finally, she found the folder. Spring term final exams, philosophy department. Her heart pounded as she scrolled through the files. Dozens of scanned exams, neatly catalogued. She clicked Jamal's name. The PDF loaded slowly, the spinning wheel taunting her. When it appeared, her stomach dropped. The handwriting was different. It wasn't Jamal's. She had seen his notebooks, his messy looping scrawl, the way his letters leaned forward as if trying to outrun each other. This handwriting was neat, angular, almost mechanical. In the content, Emily's chest tightened. It wasn't Jamal's voice. The answers read like mimicry, like someone had tried to replicate his style but missed the rhythm, the spark. The references were oddly chosen, too on the nose, almost designed to invite suspicion. Her hands trembled as she saved the file. It was true. Whitmore, or someone working with him, had replaced Jamal's exam with a forgery. She closed the laptop quickly, her pulse roaring in her ears. The next morning, she met Jamal under the old oak in Harvard Yard, away from the ears and eyes of others. She handed him her laptop. "Read it," she whispered. Jamal's eyes scanned the screen, his jaw tightening with each line. By the third page, his hands shook. This isn't me. This isn't how I write." Emily nodded. "I know. I checked the metadata. The scan was uploaded later than it should have been. A delay of nearly 12 hours. Jamal's heart pounded. "That means the original was replaced." "Yes," Emily said, her voice low. "And the replacement came from Whitmore's office." The world tilted. Jamal pressed a hand to his forehead, struggling to breathe. Everything he had feared, everything he had whispered to himself in the dark, was real. He had been framed. But one question loomed larger than all the rest. Why? Why would a Harvard professor risk everything? His reputation, his career, to frame one black student? Emily's voice trembled. "I don't know, but I think it's bigger than you." Jamal stared at her, confusion and dread tightening his chest. "Bigger?" She leaned closer. "I found something else. In the dean's files, there's been a debate in the administration about diversity admissions, about whether Harvard should scale back its efforts to recruit black students. Whitmore's been one of the loudest voices in those discussions." Jamal's stomach turned. "So this is about sending a message?" Emily nodded grimly. "If they can point to you, say, 'Look, this is what happens when we lower standards,' then they have their proof. You're not just a student to them, Jamal. You're an argument." The words hit harder than any insult. Jamal felt the ground beneath him crack. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was being used as a weapon in a battle much larger than his own life. He staggered back, pressing his palms against the bark of the oak tree. His mind replayed every whisper, every suspicious glance, every cruel comment. "Maybe you don't belong here. Maybe Harvard isn't for people like you." He had thought those were just prejudices. But now they were strategy. "Jamal," Emily said, her voice urgent, "you can't let them win. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about everyone who comes after you." He looked at her, eyes burning. "But how do I fight Harvard?" Emily's answer was quiet but firm. "With the truth, with proof." Jamal stared down at the laptop screen. The forged exam staring back at him, like a ghost. His future hung on it. His mother's sacrifices hung on it. And now he realized, the futures of countless others hung on it too. The ivory hall that once symbolized knowledge and progress had revealed its shadow. A place where power could bend truth. Where black brilliance could be twisted into proof of failure. Where one student's life could become ammunition in a war he never chose. Jamal closed the laptop slowly, his chest heaving, and then Emily whispered the words that made his blood run cold. "There's more, Jamal. I found out why Whitmore targeted you specifically. It wasn't random. It was personal." Jamal froze under the oak tree, as Emily's words echoed in his ears. It wasn't random. It was personal. He stared at her, throat tight, the sounds of students laughing and rushing past them fading into a distant hum. "What do you mean personal?" Emily hesitated, her lips pressing into a line. She glanced around nervously, as if afraid the air itself might be listening. "I found emails," she whispered, "buried in the archive server. They weren't meant for students to see. But Whitmore, he mentioned you by name." Jamal's chest constricted. "Me?" Emily nodded. "He called you a symbol. He said you were exactly the kind of student Harvard admits for optics, not merit. He wrote that if someone like you could be exposed, it would prove the dangers of pandering to diversity initiatives." The words landed like blows. Jamal clenched his fists, rage and humiliation flooding through him in equal measure. He had suspected bias. He had felt it in Whitmore's stare, heard it in his tone. But to see it written, formalized into cold administrative language, it was worse than he imagined. "Why me?" Jamal demanded, his voice breaking. "There are other black students here. Why me?" Emily's eyes softened. "Because you stood out. You weren't supposed to excel the way you did. Your grades, your arguments in class, the respect some professors started giving you. It made you visible, too visible, and Whitmore needed someone visible to make an example of." Jamal swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling. He thought of his mother's sacrifices, of nights spent hunched over books until dawn, of every step he had taken to prove himself, and now he realized, every one of those steps had painted a target on his back. That night, Jamal and Emily sat together in the library's dim corner, the laptop glowing between them. On the screen, the forged exam, the archive logs, Whitmore's access stamps, and now screenshots of the emails. Emily had risked everything to find. "This is enough," Jamal whispered, his voice trembling. "This proves he framed me. This proves he was targeting me." Emily shook her head slowly. "It should be enough. But Jamal, you need to understand something. This isn't just about Whitmore anymore. Once you bring this forward, you're going against the entire administration." Jamal frowned. "What do you mean?" "Harvard doesn't like scandal," Emily said, her tone grave. "They protect their own. If you expose Whitmore, you're not just embarrassing a professor, you're embarrassing the university, and they will fight harder to silence you than to punish him." Jamal leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words pressing down. He knew she was right. He had seen it before. Institutions closing ranks, prioritizing reputation over justice. Harvard was no different. "So what do I do?" he asked quietly. Emily met his gaze. "You tell the truth. You gather everything, every piece of evidence, and you make it impossible to ignore. Even if the board won't listen, someone outside will." The next morning, Jamal drafted his statement. His hands trembled as he typed, pouring months of research, hours of labor, every piece of evidence into a careful, precise narrative. He wrote about the exam swap, the archive logs, the emails. He wrote about Whitmore's bias, the way it had shaped every step of this case. Emily helped him compile the files into a packet, labeling each one meticulously. "If they won't listen to words, they'll have to look at proof," she said. But Jamal's confidence was fragile. He couldn't forget the look in Whitmore's eyes, the smug certainty of a man who knew the system would protect him. 2 days later, Jamal received an email from the dean's office. Meeting scheduled with the Administrative Review Board regarding allegations of academic misconduct. Attendance mandatory. His stomach dropped. The board. The very place where reputations were decided, where guilt or innocence was handed down like law. He told Emily, and she immediately grew tense. "They're moving fast. Too fast. Usually these things take weeks." Jamal frowned. "Why would they rush it?" "Because," Emily whispered, "they want to get ahead of whatever you're about to present. If they make their decision before you speak, the narrative is theirs, not yours." Jamal's pulse quickened. "So they want to bury me before I even have a chance to fight?" Emily nodded grimly. "That's exactly what they want." The day of the meeting, Jamal walked into University Hall, with his head high, even as his chest ached with dread. The corridors were lined with portraits of Harvard presidents and donors, white men whose stern gazes seemed to follow him. He felt the centuries pressing down, whispering that he didn't belong here, that his presence was always conditional. Emily walked beside him, clutching the folder of evidence like a shield. She wasn't supposed to be there. Students under review were usually forced to come alone, but she refused to let him walk in unarmed. When they entered the chamber, the air was thick with authority. A long oak table dominated the room, around which sat members of the board, senior professors, administrators, and at the center, Dean Marshall. Whitmore sat off to the side, his expression calm, almost smug. "Mr. Richardson," Dean Marshall began, his voice clipped. "This hearing concerns allegations of academic dishonesty in your final examination. You will have the opportunity to speak, though I remind you that integrity of process is paramount." Jamal swallowed, forcing his voice steady. "I have proof that the exam presented as mine is not the one I submitted." A ripple of murmurs swept through the board. Whitmore's jaw twitched, but his eyes remained cold. Before Jamal could continue, Marshall raised a hand. "We will review what is necessary in due time. But first, Professor Whitmore will present his case." Whitmore rose. Unfolding his papers with deliberate calm, he began to read about the exam, the similarities to Kemp, the importance of integrity. His words were sharp, rehearsed, every sentence crafted to reinforce Jamal's guilt. As he spoke, Jamal clenched his fists beneath the table, the folder of evidence burning in Emily's lap. He wanted to interrupt, to shout the truth, but the formality of the room pressed down on him. Here, Whitmore's voice wasn't just opinion, it was authority. When Whitmore finished, Dean Marshall nodded. "Thank you. Mr. Richardson, you may respond." Jamal opened his mouth, but before he could speak, another administrator interjected. "Before we proceed, the board has voted to formally recognize the evidence already submitted by Professor Whitmore. The case against Mr. Richardson is considered valid pending his defense." Emily's eyes widened. She gripped Jamal's arm under the table, her face pale. "They're locking you in," she whispered. Jamal's heart pounded. He hadn't even presented his defense yet, but the verdict was already being framed. He was no longer just fighting Whitmore. He was fighting the weight of Harvard itself, an institution desperate to protect its image, even at the cost of destroying him. The board began murmuring, shuffling papers, whispering to each other. Jamal's chest ached. He thought of his mother, of the hours she spent bent over hospital floors, believing Harvard would change everything. He thought of Emily, risking her future just to help him. He thought of himself, a boy who had dreamed of being more, now reduced to a caricature of failure. And then, the gavel struck. Dean Marshall's voice was calm, final. "This board will proceed to disciplinary review. Effective immediately, Mr. Richardson is suspended from all academic activities pending final decision." The words slammed into Jamal, like a physical blow. His vision blurred. His throat tightened. Emily half rose from her seat. "You can't do this. He has evidence." "Miss Carter," Marshall interrupted sharply, "you are not a party to this hearing. Any further disruption will result in your removal." Emily sat back slowly, her face burning, her eyes wide with fury and helplessness. Jamal stared at the table, his hands trembling. He had come prepared to defend himself, but Harvard hadn't given him the chance. The system had spoken, and it had spoken against him. As he sat there in stunned silence, the bailiff entered the chamber, handing Marshall a sealed envelope. The dean opened it, scanned the contents, and his eyes flickered. He looked up at Jamal with something sharper than disdain, fear. The sealed envelope sat in Dean Marshall's hands, its presence heavy in the silent chamber. His expression shifted briefly, a flicker that Jamal caught even through the haze of humiliation. It wasn't disdain this time. It was unease. Marshall tucked the envelope under his papers without comment. "Proceed," he said. His voice was steady, but Jamal heard the crack beneath it. Jamal lifted his head. His hands shook, but his voice found steel. "You've heard Whitmore's accusations, but you haven't heard my defense. And if you refuse to hear it, then you are not protecting Harvard's integrity. You're destroying it." The room stilled. Board members shifted in their seats. For a student to speak this boldly, especially in front of a man like Whitmore, bordered on unthinkable. But Jamal pressed forward. "I did not plagiarize. I did not cheat. Every idea I put on that exam was mine, built on months of study, reflection, and analysis. But you don't want to hear that, because it's easier to believe that someone like me couldn't possibly think those thoughts on his own." A murmur rippled through the board. Whitmore's jaw tightened, but his face remained calm, smug even. Jamal opened his bag and pulled out a stack of notebooks, worn and frayed at the edges. He laid them on the table one by one. "These are my drafts, my process. Every sleepless night, every crossout, every reference checked and rechecked. They prove the work was mine." He then pulled out his laptop. "And here, files going back months, date-stamped, notes on Kemp's commentary, yes. But also on dozens of other scholars. Not copied, engaged with. That's what scholarship is supposed to be. Not obedience, not mimicry, dialogue." Emily, seated at the back despite being warned, leaned forward as Jamal continued. His voice grew stronger with each word, fueled not by anger but by the clarity of truth. "You think my mind couldn't produce these answers because you never saw it, because you never looked. But while you were dismissing me, I was building something you couldn't imagine." He opened another folder on his laptop, projecting it onto the boardroom screen. The members leaned forward as titles filled the display. Independent research projects. Richardson, J. Unpublished manuscripts. Richardson, J. Published articles. Pseudonyms. One by one, Jamal explained. The papers he had submitted anonymously to small journals, unwilling to risk rejection if his identity revealed his race. The research he had shared under pen names, which had quietly circulated and even been cited by graduate students, work that had been invisible until now. A board member, Professor Lin, squinted at the screen. Are you suggesting these are your publications? They are mine, Jamal said firmly. I wrote them. I published them under pseudonyms, because I knew my name wouldn't be given the same benefit of the doubt as others. But the ideas are mine. The work is mine. And the dates, the submissions, the email records, they all prove it. He opened one of the manuscripts, an essay on the philosophy of governance that had been cited internationally. This piece, he said, was published under the name R. James, but every word is mine. You can compare it to my drafts in these notebooks. The handwriting, the references, it's all here. I've been contributing to the very field Whitmore claims I don't belong in. The boardroom was silent now, the weight of his revelation pressing down. Some members exchanged uneasy glances. Others frowned, unsure of how to reconcile what they were seeing with the narrative they had been fed. Jamal took a deep breath, his voice breaking now with raw emotion. I didn't cheat. I excelled. And instead of being recognized, I was erased. Because for some of you, it is easier to believe I cheated than to believe I am brilliant. His words cut through the room like a blade. Emily's eyes filled with tears. For the first time, she saw the full scope of Jamal's brilliance. The years of hidden work, the resilience behind every line of thought. Professor Lin leaned back, her face pale. If this is true, then we have failed you. But Whitmore didn't flinch. His face was stone, his eyes cold, and in that silence, Jamal understood something. Brilliance alone might not be enough. For a moment, though, it felt like the tide was turning. Some board members began whispering among themselves. Marshall's lips pressed into a thin line, his hand tightening on the envelope, as if weighing something heavier than paper. Jamal pressed forward, pulling out one final notebook. This, he said, voice shaking, is my original exam draft. I kept it, handwritten, the one I typed my final answers from. Compare it to the so-called exam Whitmore presented. The handwriting doesn't match. The phrasing doesn't match, because it isn't mine. My work was stolen. My name was put on a forgery. A ripple of gasps filled the room. Even the board members who had looked ready to dismiss him froze. Whitmore's lips twitched, just slightly, enough for Jamal to see it. A crack in the mask. The truth was undeniable now. Jamal wasn't just innocent. He was extraordinary. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Jamal allowed himself to believe he might win. But then Whitmore stood. His movements were slow, deliberate, the silence heavy as he reached into his folder. Impressive, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Quite the performance. You almost had me convinced. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the table. But you forgot one thing, Mr. Richardson. Integrity isn't only about work. It's about character. Jamal frowned, his pulse quickening. What is that? Whitmore's smile widened. A testimony. The board members leaned forward as Whitmore continued. From someone who knows you well. Someone who claims you admitted, in private, that you had cut corners before. That this wasn't the first time you've taken what wasn't yours. Emily's head snapped up. That's a lie. Whitmore ignored her, his eyes locked on Jamal. A close friend of yours, Mr. Richardson. A roommate. Jamal's chest seized. His breath came short, shallow. Ryan? Whitmore's smile was thin, cruel. Yes. Ryan Parker, your own roommate, has testified that you bragged about gaming the system before, that you knew how to avoid being caught, that this exam was simply the first time you slipped. The room erupted in murmurs. Jamal's vision blurred. Ryan, the one person who had seen him study every night, who had watched him push himself until exhaustion, the one person who knew the truth. And now he had betrayed him. Jamal's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. His defense had swayed the board, but with one accusation from someone so close, the fragile tide of truth threatened to collapse again. The boardroom fell into uneasy silence, as Whitmore's words echoed. Your own roommate testified against you. Jamal's chest tightened. He gripped the edge of the table, fighting to breathe. Ryan, the same Ryan who had eaten with him, laughed with him, asked him for notes before exams. The one who had seen him studying, until dawn. The one person who knew he never cheated. Emily's eyes widened in shock. That's impossible, she blurted. Ryan wouldn't, but even as she spoke, the truth settled in Jamal's stomach like lead. Ryan had been distant for weeks. The late-night phone calls, the way he'd avoided eye contact, the silence whenever Jamal tried to talk about the case. It all made sense now. Whitmore slid the paper closer to the board members. Ryan Parker's testimony is clear. He recalls Richardson bragging about knowing how to get away with things and admitting that exams were easy to manipulate. Jamal slammed his palm on the table. That's a lie. His voice cracked with fury. I never said that. I would never say that. Dean Marshall raised a hand for silence. Mr. Richardson, you will compose yourself. Emotional outbursts will not help your case. Jamal's eyes burned. Compose myself. You're using a false testimony to destroy me, and I'm supposed to sit quietly. The board members shifted uncomfortably, some looking at Jamal with pity, others with suspicion. Whitmore's face remained stone, a portrait of manufactured patience. Emily leaned toward Jamal, her voice low but fierce. They're trying to isolate you. Don't let them. Jamal's chest heaved. He wanted to believe her, but the weight of betrayal pressed harder than anything Whitmore had said. That evening, Jamal walked back to his dorm in a daze. The campus lights blurred into streaks, the air thick with whispers. Every passing glance felt like judgment, every muffled laugh like confirmation of his guilt. When he entered his room, Ryan was sitting at his desk, headphones around his neck. He looked up, guilt flashing across his face before quickly hardening. You, Jamal whispered, his voice trembling. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. Jamal, listen. Listen. Jamal stepped closer, his hands shaking. You told them I admitted to cheating. You told them lies. Ryan's jaw tightened. I didn't have a choice. Jamal's breath caught. Didn't have a choice. You had every choice. You knew the truth. You saw me work. And you still, his voice broke. You still sold me out. Ryan stood abruptly, his voice rising. You don't get it. They came to me. The dean, Whitmore. They said if I didn't cooperate I'd be dragged into this too. They said my academic record would suffer. They pressured me, Jamal. What was I supposed to do? Sacrifice my future for yours? Jamal stared at him, stunned. So you saved yourself by stabbing me in the back. Ryan's shoulders slumped. He couldn't meet Jamal's eyes. I'm sorry. Jamal laughed bitterly, though tears stung his eyes. Sorry doesn't erase what you did. Sorry doesn't fix the fact that you just gave them exactly what they wanted. Proof that I don't belong here. Ryan's silence was louder than any answer. Jamal grabbed his bag and walked out, the door slamming behind him. Emily found him hours later, sitting alone on the steps of Widener Library. His shoulders were hunched, his face buried in his hands. They got to him, she said softly, sitting beside him. Jamal lifted his head, his eyes red. I thought if anyone believed me, it would be him. But he chose them. He chose himself. Emily's voice was gentle, but firm. That's what they do. They twist the people around you until you're alone. That's how the system survives, by making you think no one is on your side. Jamal shook his head. Maybe I am alone. Maybe that's the truth. Emily grabbed his hand, forcing him to look at her. You're not alone. I believe you, and I'm not going anywhere. The words struck deep. For a moment, Jamal let himself breathe. But doubt still gnawed. If even Ryan could be turned, what chance did he have against an institution like Harvard? The next board session was worse. Whitmore presented Ryan's testimony with ruthless precision, framing it as the final nail in the coffin. Some board members nodded, their skepticism fading into certainty. Character matters, Whitmore concluded, and Mr. Richardson's has been called into question by those who know him best. Jamal clenched his fists under the table, his throat raw from silence. He wanted to scream that Ryan had been coerced, that Whitmore's entire case was built on lies. But every protest was met with cold reprimands. The board began whispering among themselves. Jamal caught fragments, consistent pattern, troubling, undermines trust. Emily's hand brushed his under the table, a small reminder that he wasn't completely abandoned. But her face was tight with worry. As the session adjourned, Jamal felt the noose tightening. His evidence had been strong, undeniable, but Ryan's betrayal had shifted the narrative. Now the board wasn't weighing proof. They were weighing character, and in their eyes, his character was collapsing. That night, Jamal sat in his room, staring at the notebook spread across his desk. His entire life's work, every word, Every thought, every sacrifice, it all felt fragile, paper against a storm. His phone buzzed. A new message. It was from an unknown number. "You don't know me, but you need to hear this." Attached was an audio file. Jamal hesitated, his finger hovering before he pressed play. The recording crackled to life. At first only muffled voices. Then clear, Ryan's voice. "I don't want to do this. He's my roommate." Another voice, sharp, authoritative. "Dean Marshall. You'll do it if you care about your future. If you don't cooperate, you'll find your name in the same file as his. One accusation can ruin you just as easily. Mr. Parker." Silence. Then Ryan's broken voice. "Fine. I'll say it." Jamal's breath caught. His hands trembled as the recording ended. Emily's voice echoed in his memory. "They twist the people around you until you're alone." But now, here was proof. Proof of the manipulation. Proof that Ryan hadn't betrayed him freely. He had been cornered. Jamal clutched the phone, his heart pounding. He finally had something that could expose not just Whitmore but the dean himself. But if he used it, he knew, the battle would escalate into a war. Harvard would do anything to win. The recording played again and again in Jamal's dorm room, each repetition digging deeper into his chest. "I don't want to do this. He's my roommate. You'll do it if you care about your future." Ryan's voice. Dean Marshall's voice. Together they were a dagger and a shield. Proof that the betrayal wasn't born of malice but of coercion. Proof that Whitmore wasn't alone in this. That Harvard's leadership itself had dirtied its hands. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her face pale but determined. "This is it. This is what we need." Jamal's hands trembled as he clutched the phone. "If we present this, they'll have no choice. They'll have to admit what they've done." Emily shook her head, her eyes sharp. "No, Jamal, you don't understand. If we present this without backing it up, they'll claim it's fake. They'll bury it and call it doctored. We need more. We need to tie it directly to the exam swap." Jamal's stomach twisted. "But the verdict is tomorrow," Emily finished. "We have less than 24 hours to find everything." The weight of it pressed down on them both. A single day to unravel a conspiracy years in the making. The night stretched long. They huddled in the library, laptops open, papers scattered. Emily hacked deeper into the archive system than she ever dared before, her fingers moving fast across the keyboard. Jamal combed through his notebooks, pulling together every scrap of work that proved his process, his originality. Hours passed, their exhaustion mounting. Jamal rubbed his temples, his head pounding. Even with the recording, what if it's not enough? What if they still side with Whitmore? Emily didn't look up from the screen. "Then we don't just save you, we expose them, publicly. If the board refuses to act, we'll go outside. Media, social platforms. Harvard can't silence the world." The idea chilled Jamal. To fight Harvard in the court of public opinion was to risk everything. His name, his future, his privacy. But what choice did he have? He thought of his mother, sitting at the kitchen table with cracked hands and tired eyes, telling him the truth couldn't be stolen. He thought of Ryan, broken by fear but still forced to betray. And he thought of himself, a boy who had been told he didn't belong, now standing at the edge of being erased completely. "I won't let them take this from me," Jamal whispered. Emily finally looked up. "Then we have to move fast." They began with the surveillance system. If Whitmore had swapped the exams, there had to be a trace. Cameras lined the corridors outside the exam hall, some inside near the doors. Emily found the security office hours before dawn, empty except for a tired graduate assistant on overnight duty. Emily leaned on the counter. "We're working on a misconduct review. We need access to exam hall footage." The assistant frowned. "I can't just." Jamal stepped forward, his voice steady but raw. "Please, my future depends on this. If I'm lying, you'll see. But if I'm not," his throat caught, "then maybe the truth finally comes out." The assistant hesitated, then sighed. 10 minutes. That's all I can give you." They dove into the footage, scrubbing through hours of exam day recordings. Students entered, papers shuffled, bodies shifted nervously in their seats. Jamal felt his stomach churn watching himself sit in the middle row, head bent over his paper, focused. Then something. Whitmore after the exam ended. Lingering by the pile of tests, the students had already filed out. He picked up the stack, flipped through, paused on one. His eyes darted to the empty hall before sliding a paper from his folder into the pile. Emily froze the screen, her hand over her mouth. "There. That's it. Jamal leaned closer, his heart hammering. The footage was grainy, but the motion was clear. A swap. A deliberate swap. Save it, Jamal whispered. The assistant glanced nervously at the clock. Time's up. I'll get in trouble if Emily pressed. Her voice urgent. Please, just this clip. That's all. The assistant hesitated, then dragged the file onto a drive. If anyone asks, you didn't get it from me. They left the office with the evidence burning hot in Emily's hand. But when they opened the file hours later, dread swept over them. The footage stuttered, pixelated, frames skipping. Whitmore's motion was visible, but his hand and the paper blurred, indistinguishable, enough to raise suspicion, but maybe not enough to convict. Jamal's heart sank. They'll say it's inconclusive, that it's nothing. Emily bit her lip, her eyes scanning furiously. There has to be something else, some log, some record. She dove back into the system, searching not for video but for digital traces, scans, timestamps, logins. Her fingers flew, exhaustion forgotten, determination burning. Then she froze. Jamal, look at this. On the screen, an upload record from the exam archive. The metadata was clear. Jamal's exam had been scanned not once, but twice. The first upload was time-stamped the day of the exam. The second, nearly 12 hours later, linked to Whitmore's faculty login. Jamal's breath caught. He replaced it. The original was uploaded first, then deleted, and he put in the forgery. Emily's hands shook. If we can recover that first file, her voice trailed off. They both knew what it meant. The original exam might still exist, hidden deep in the system, but finding it in time, that was the challenge. The sun rose pale over Harvard as Jamal and Emily raced the clock. Hours bled into minutes. They searched databases, traced shadow files, combed through system caches. Jamal's eyes burned, his head heavy with fatigue, but he refused to stop. Emily muttered under her breath, "Come on, come on." And then a flash of text, a buried file, corrupted, but not erased. Emily gasped. "I think this is it." Jamal leaned in, his chest tight. "Open it." The file loaded slowly, fragmented pieces of scanned pages filling the screen. It was faint, jagged, but the handwriting was his. His messy scrawl, his rushed notes, his original answers. Tears pricked his eyes. "That's mine. That's my exam." Emily's face lit with relief. "We found it." But then the screen flickered. A warning box appeared. "Unauthorized access detected. Connection will be terminated." Emily's hands flew across the keys. "They know we're in. Someone's trying to cut us off." Jamal's heart pounded. "Save it. Please save it." The progress bar crawled. Every second an eternity. 12%. The screen froze at 92%. Jamal's breath hitched. No, no, no. Emily slammed the enter key, rerouting the save to the flash drive. The bar ticked forward. 95%, 99%, and then the system crashed. The screen went black. Emily yanked out the drive, her hands shaking. "I don't know if it finished. We'll have to check later." Jamal sat back, his chest heaving. Minutes. They had minutes before the hearing, and all they had was a corrupted file, a shaky video, and a recording that put the dean himself in the crosshairs. "Is it enough?" Jamal whispered. Emily met his gaze. Her eyes burned with determination. "We don't have a choice. It has to be." The board convened again, the air tense and final. Whitmore sat smugly, the board members poised as though the verdict had already been written. Dean Marshall cleared his throat. "This hearing will conclude today. Unless Ms. Richardson has final remarks, the board will deliver its decision." Jamal rose slowly, his legs trembling but his voice steady. "I have proof." The room stilled. He pulled the flash drive from his pocket and set it on the table. "Proof that my exam was swapped. Proof that Professor Whitmore framed me. And proof that the dean himself coerced my roommate to lie." Gasps rippled through the board. Marshall's face drained of color. Whitmore stiffened, his composure cracking. Emily slid the drive into the projector, her hands trembling as the files loaded. The video, the metadata logs, the recording, and finally the corrupted file, opening jagged and broken on the screen. It wasn't complete. Pages were missing, scans distorted, but the handwriting was clear. The words were Jamal's. The truth was there, faint but undeniable. The board members leaned in, their whispers sharp and frantic. For the first time, Jamal saw doubt flicker in their eyes, not toward him but toward the institution they represented. And just as Dean Marshall began to rise, voice trembling with damage control, Emily gasped. Her laptop pinged with a new notification. An automatic system recovery had completed. The missing file, the full original exam, was restored. The ping of Emily's laptop echoed through the boardroom like a gunshot. Heads turned, whispers rose, and the tension in the air thickened until Jamal could barely breathe. On the screen, a small icon blinked. System recovery complete. File restored. Emily's eyes widened. She clicked quickly, and the screen filled with page after page of Jamal's handwritten exam. Full, unbroken, undeniable. His messy scrawl leapt off the screen, jagged and hurried, but alive with his voice. Gasps rippled through the board. Professor Lin leaned forward, her hand covering her mouth. This is his original exam. Whitmore stiffened. For the first time, the calm mask cracked. His jaw twitched, his eyes narrowing as the evidence glared back at him. Jamal rose from his chair, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. You wanted proof. This is it. My words. My work. Not the forgery you planted in its place. The room buzzed with whispers, the committee members shifting in their seats. Dean Marshall's face was pale, his knuckles white against the oak table. Emily pulled up the metadata logs next, her voice sharp. The system shows 2 uploads. The first, Jamal's exam. The second, 12 hours later, under Professor Whitmore's credentials. That is when the forgery was placed. The board erupted in murmurs. One member demanded, "Is this verified?" Another hissed, "This could be catastrophic." Jamal slammed his notebook onto the table, the sound cracking like thunder. Catastrophic? You mean embarrassing? Because the truth doesn't damage Harvard. It exposes it. You didn't want to see me as brilliant, so you painted me a cheater. You didn't want to admit Whitmore was wrong, so you tried to bury me. This isn't about academic integrity. It's about protecting the illusion that only certain kinds of people belong here. His words cut the room into silence. For a heartbeat, all that could be heard was his own breath, ragged but strong. Whitmore finally stood, his face flushed. This is absurd. The system can be manipulated. This so-called evidence fabricated by desperate students, Emily snapped. Her voice, usually quiet, rang like steel. Fabricated? You mean like the exam you swapped? Or the testimony you forced through intimidation? Whitmore's eyes darkened. Watch your tone, Miss Carter. No, Emily said firmly, standing now beside Jamal. You don't get to silence me. You silenced him. You tried to erase him, but you won't silence me. The recording proves the dean coerced Ryan into lying. The footage shows you tampering with the exams, and this file proves Jamal's work was authentic all along. The weight of her words pressed hard against the board. Several members looked stricken. Professor Lin whispered, "This is unconscionable." Jamal turned toward Whitmore, his voice low but cutting. "You told me to know my place. Well, here I am, standing in the place I earned. Not because of quotas, not because of charity, but because of brilliance you couldn't stand to see in someone like me." Whitmore's composure finally broke. "You think you've won? You think this spectacle changes anything? The reputation of this institution cannot be dragged down by one bitter student." Jamal stepped forward, his voice rising. "This isn't just about me. This is about every student who has been doubted, dismissed, or erased because they didn't fit the picture you had in your head. Every black student who walks into these halls with brilliance, only to be treated as a quota. Every name that has been whispered as lucky, instead of earned. I'm not speaking just for myself. I'm speaking for all of them." The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Emily's voice trembled with urgency. "You can't ignore this. Not anymore. The evidence is in front of you. If you protect Whitmore, then you're not just complicit. You're guilty of the very prejudice this university claims to fight against." Dean Marshall cleared his throat, his voice strained. "Enough. The board will recess to deliberate." The gavel struck once, sharp and final. But the sound did not carry authority. It carried desperation. The committee rose, shuffling into a side chamber, their faces pale, their whispers frantic. Whitmore lingered for a moment, his eyes locked on Jamal with venom. "You'll regret this," he hissed. Jamal held his gaze. "Not as much as you will." Whitmore turned sharply and left with the others. The chamber emptied, leaving Jamal and Emily alone in the heavy silence. Jamal sank back into his chair, his hands trembling. For the first time he allowed himself to feel the weight of it. The weeks of whispers, the betrayals, the accusations. Emily touched his arm. You did it. You showed them the truth. Jamal shook his head slowly. Did I, or did I just show them something they'll bury deeper to protect themselves? Her silence said more than words. Minutes stretched into an hour. Jamal's mind raced with every possible outcome. Would they expel him anyway? Would they smear him publicly? Discredit the evidence? Would they punish Emily for standing with him? The door finally opened. The board members filed back in, their faces unreadable. Dean Marshall sat at the head of the table, the envelope from earlier now gone. He cleared his throat. The committee has reviewed the evidence. The decision is as follows. Jamal's heart thundered in his ears. Mr. Richardson, while irregularities were found in the examination process, the board cannot conclusively determine misconduct on the part of faculty. Emily gasped. What? Marshall continued, his tone tight. Therefore, while your suspension will be lifted, no further action will be taken. The matter is closed. The words hit like a blow. Jamal staggered back. Closed? You saw the proof. You heard the recording. You know I was framed. Whitmore smirked faintly from the corner. His posture suddenly relaxed again. Professor Lynn spoke up, her voice sharp with protest. This is outrageous. The evidence was clear. Marshall silenced her with a glare. This board has decided. For the sake of the institution, we will not pursue further action. Emily's voice trembled with fury. For the sake of the institution. You mean for the sake of your reputation? The board members avoided her gaze, their silence an answer in itself. Jamal's chest ached, his vision blurring. He had fought, he had bared his soul, he had revealed his brilliance, and still, the system bent to protect itself. As the gavel struck to close the session, a new voice rose from the back of the room, a journalist's voice, recorder in hand. Excuse me, did I just hear that Harvard knowingly ignored evidence of racial sabotage? The journalist's voice cut through the boardroom like a blade. Excuse me, did I just hear that Harvard knowingly ignored evidence of racial sabotage? Every head turned toward the back of the room. A woman in a crisp blazer, her press badge gleaming, held a recorder high. Her eyes were sharp, unblinking. She had slipped in quietly, unnoticed while the board deliberated, and now her presence shifted the balance of power in the room. Dean Marshall froze, his lips parted, but no words came. For a man who had built his career on composure, the mask cracked under the weight of that single question. Whitmore stiffened, his smug calm evaporating. This is a closed session. You have no right. The journalist cut him off, her tone icy. Then explain why a student produced direct evidence of tampering and coercion, and yet the board just ruled there was no conclusive misconduct. Is Harvard more concerned with its image than with justice? The silence was damning. Jamal stood slowly, his voice low but steady. That's exactly what they're concerned with. His words hung heavy in the air. The committee members shifted uncomfortably, their whispers rising in a panicked hum. Emily leaned toward Jamal, her eyes wide. They didn't know she was here. Jamal clenched his fists. Good. Now the world will know. The board recessed in chaos. Members huddled in corners, their voices low, urgent. Marshall barked orders to aides to remove the journalist. But it was too late. She already had the story. This will go public, Professor Lynn warned, her voice sharp. And when it does, the university will face consequences far beyond embarrassment. Whitmore bristled, his face flushed. We cannot allow outside forces to dictate academic proceedings. This is our institution. We control the narrative.
Lynn snapped back.
Control or cover up? There's a difference. The room fractured into factions, those desperate to protect Harvard's name, and those who couldn't ignore the evidence laid bare. Meanwhile, Jamal and Emily waited in the hall, the weight of every minute pressing down. Jamal's mother called, her voice trembling with fear. What's happening, Jamal? They know the truth, Jamal said, his voice breaking. But I don't know if they'll admit it. His mother was silent for a long moment, then said, Remember, baby, even if they don't, you already won. You spoke the truth. You made them hear you. Jamal closed his eyes, fighting the tears. But will it matter? Inside the chamber, the debate raged. Marshall slammed his hand on the table. Do you understand what's at stake? If this story leaks, we risk national headlines accusing Harvard of racism and corruption. Donors will pull support. Admissions will be scrutinized. Centuries of prestige damaged. Lynn leaned forward, her eyes blazing. And what about Jamal Richardson? What about his life? His future? You're willing to sacrifice him for the sake of donors? Another board member spoke hesitantly. Perhaps a compromise. Lift his suspension, quietly expunge the record, but avoid public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Lynn scoffed. So he gets silence instead of justice. That's no compromise. That's cowardice. The whispers rose again, louder now, the pressure mounting. The journalist's presence had changed the stakes. Reputation could no longer be preserved in secrecy. It was already bleeding out into the world. Outside, Jamal paced the hall, Emily by his side. His chest ached with dread. Do you think they'll actually do the right thing? Emily hesitated. I think they'll do whatever they think saves them. The question is, do they think saving you or burying you saves them more? Her words chilled him. For Harvard, it wasn't about truth. It was about optics, strategy, survival. He wasn't a person to them. He was a liability, a symbol, a headline. Minutes stretched into hours. Every sound from inside the chamber made Jamal's pulse jump. He thought of all the nights he had sat at his desk, poring over texts, believing that brilliance alone was enough. He thought of his mother's sacrifices, the hours she had bled into double shifts, so he could sit in classrooms where he was never fully seen. He thought of every whisper that had followed him. Quota, lucky, cheater. He whispered, almost to himself. If they erase this, it proves they were never about justice. They were about control. Emily's hand tightened around his. Then, we take the truth outside. If they won't give you justice, the world will demand it. Finally, the doors opened. The board filed back in, their faces pale, strained. Jamal and Emily were summoned inside. The room was quieter now, the atmosphere suffocating. Marshall sat rigid, his voice tight. Mr. Richardson, Miss Carter, the board has reached a decision. Jamal's chest constricted. Every nerve in his body braced. Marshall continued, his words carefully measured. In light of newly presented evidence, the board acknowledges significant irregularities in the handling of your exam. Accordingly, the charges of academic dishonesty against you are dismissed. Your record will be cleared. Relief crashed over Jamal like a wave. But it was short-lived. Marshall's voice hardened. However, the board also concludes that further action against faculty is unnecessary. The matter will be sealed. Public discussion of this case will not be permitted. Harvard's reputation must remain intact. Emily's eyes blazed. So you admit he was innocent, but you refuse to hold anyone accountable? Whitmore smirked faintly, sitting tall once again. His silence was louder than triumph. Professor Lynn rose, slamming her hand on the table. This is unacceptable. The truth is clear. To bury it now is to declare to every student of color that their voices don't matter. Marshall glared at her. Enough. The decision is final. Jamal's body shook with fury. He stared at the faces around the table. The men and women who had weighed his life against the prestige of their institution, and chosen prestige. His voice came low, trembling but strong. So that's it? You destroy my name. You drag me through hell. And when the truth comes out, you hide it to protect yourselves. No one answered. Emily's voice cracked as she turned to the board. Do you realize what you're saying? That reputation matters more than justice? That this place isn't about learning or truth. It's about power. Still, silent. Jamal's chest heaved. You wanted me to know my place. Well, I know it now. My place is to tell the world what you did here. You can silence me in this room, but you won't silence me outside it. The journalist, still standing in the back, scribbled furiously in her notebook. The board members' faces paled further. The secret was no longer theirs to control. Marshall rose, his face like stone. This session is adjourned. The gavel struck, but the sound no longer carried authority. It carried fear. Jamal stood frozen, his fists clenched, his body trembling with rage and exhaustion. Emily touched his arm gently, whispering, You're free, Jamal. But it's not over, not by a long shot. He nodded slowly, his eyes burning with tears. His freedom had come at a cost. The truth buried, the injustice unpunished. For him, this wasn't victory, it was survival. And yet, deep down, he knew, survival could be the seed of revolution. As the board members began to file out, the journalist's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her eyes widening. Jamal, she whispered urgently. The story's already out. Someone leaked everything. The journalist's voice trembled with urgency as she held up her phone. It's already out. The leak's gone viral. Every board member froze. Dean Marshall's face blanched, his lips parting in disbelief. Whitmore, for the first time, looked shaken, his composure unraveling. Emily leaned closer to Jamal, her whisper fierce. "They can't bury it now." Jamal stood slowly, his chest heavy, his hands trembling at his sides. For weeks he had carried the suffocating weight of silence, suspicion, and humiliation. And now the silence was broken. Not just in this room but beyond Harvard's walls. By nightfall, the story was everywhere. Headlines flashed across national networks. Harvard professor accused of framing black student. Systemic racism at the Ivy League. Evidence emerges. Jamal Richardson's case sparks questions on academic integrity and race. Clips of the recording. Dean Marshall coercing Ryan. Spread like wildfire. Screenshots of the swapped exam logs filled social feeds. Hashtags surged. Justice for Jamal. Harvard exposed. Truth over prestige. For the first time, Jamal's name wasn't whispered in suspicion. It was shouted in outrage, in solidarity, in hope. Yet victory didn't feel clean. In his dorm room, Jamal sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the glow of his phone, as message after message poured in. Former classmates apologized for doubting him. Strangers offered support. Activists demanded Harvard be held accountable. But beneath the flood of validation, his chest ached with something raw. The betrayal lingered, Ryan's voice cracking under pressure, the board's cold dismissal, the way Whitmore's accusation had shattered his sense of belonging. Emily sat beside him, her voice gentle. "You should be proud. You fought back, Jamal. You won." He shook his head slowly. "Did I? They cleared my name because the world forced them to. But they didn't admit the truth until it was dragged out of them. That's not justice. It's damage control." Emily's silence was heavy with agreement. Days later, Harvard released a statement. It was polished, clinical, written by lawyers. The university recognizes irregularities in the handling of Mr. Richardson's exam. While academic dishonesty was not substantiated, the institution reaffirms its commitment to fairness and equity. Nowhere in the statement did they admit Whitmore's sabotage. Nowhere did they acknowledge the racial bias. It was a half-confession, carefully crafted to quiet outrage without admitting guilt. Still, the damage was done. Whitmore's name became synonymous with disgrace. His lectures were suspended, his office cleared, students protested outside his home, chanting for accountability. For a man who once commanded respect across the Ivy League, the fall was sharp, brutal, and complete. Dean Marshall tried to weather the storm, but the recording was too damning. Within weeks he announced his resignation, citing personal reasons. Jamal returned to class eventually, his head high but his heart heavy. The same lecture hall, where Whitmore had humiliated him, now held whispers of a different kind. Students glanced at him with awe, guilt, sometimes shame. Some offered quiet apologies in the hall. Others avoided him altogether, unable to face what their silence had enabled. Jamal sat in the middle row, notebook open, pen in hand. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't bracing for whispers of cheater. But the memory of that day, the sting of humiliation, the laughter in the air, still haunted him. The classroom was no longer just a place of learning. It was the battlefield where he had been tried, condemned, and redeemed. And though he had survived, the scars remained. National conversations exploded. News anchors debated whether elite institutions perpetuated systemic racism. Opinion columns dissected Jamal's story, using his name as both example and warning. Panels of experts argued about diversity, equity, and accountability. Some called Jamal a hero, a symbol of resilience against injustice. Others dismissed him as an exception, missing the point entirely. Through it all, Jamal remained quiet. He didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted to be a student. But the choice had never been his. At home, his mother sat on their worn couch, the news playing softly in the background. She watched her son's face appear on television, his name scrolling across the screen. Tears slid down her cheeks, not of sorrow but of pride and relief. She whispered to the empty room, "You made them listen, baby." Her phone buzzed with calls from neighbors, old friends, even strangers who had seen the story. They praised Jamal, praised her, but she knew the truth. The fight had taken something from him that no headline could restore. One evening, Jamal and Emily walked across Harvard Yard, the autumn air crisp, the leaves falling around them. The campus buzzed with tension, students divided between outrage and unease. "Do you think anything will actually change?" Jamal asked quietly. Emily looked at him, her eyes soft. Maybe not right away, but your story, it's already bigger than this place. You didn't just clear your name. You lit a fire. Jamal exhaled, his breath clouding in the cold air. It shouldn't take someone almost losing everything for people to see what's wrong. Emily nodded. But now they can't pretend they don't see it. They walked in silence, the weight of truth heavy, but undeniable. Weeks later, Jamal received an invitation. A national education conference wanted him to speak. At first he resisted. He wasn't an activist. He told himself. He wasn't a spokesperson. He was just a student who wanted to learn. But then he remembered Whitmore's words. Know your place. And he realized his place wasn't silence. His place was voice. He stood at the podium weeks later, the room filled with educators, policymakers, and students. His voice was steady. His words sharp. I was accused of cheating. Not because I cheated, but because I was never seen as capable of brilliance. My story is not unique. It is a symptom of a system that doubts some of us before we even speak. And the question isn't whether I was innocent. The question is how many others were never given the chance to prove they were. The room erupted in applause. Some wiped tears. Others shifted uncomfortably, confronted by truths they had long ignored. Back at Harvard, Jamal returned to the lecture hall one last time. The room was empty, the seats still, the silence thick. He walked to the desk where Whitmore once stood, where his humiliation had begun. He placed his notebook down and whispered, "You tried to erase me, but I'm still here." The weight lifted. Not gone, not forgotten, but transformed. The story did not end neatly. Jamal's name would forever be tied to scandal and debate. Harvard continued to polish its image while quietly dodging accountability. Whitmore's disgrace became a cautionary tale, but not a revolution. And yet conversations had shifted. Students whispered less and spoke more. Faculty meetings raised questions once buried. Across the country, other Jamals stepped forward, emboldened by his story. Jamal had not just survived. He had cracked the facade. As Jamal left the hall that day, the echoes of whispers still clinging to the walls, a question gnawed at him. A question that stretched beyond Harvard, beyond himself. How many other Jamals had been silenced before the world ever heard their truth? Stories like Jamal's aren't just fiction. They echo real lives, real struggles, and real silences. If his fight for truth moved you, type yes if you believe in justice, and subscribe so these voices are never ignored again.